Hi, Misha here, and I felt like it was time to revisit the Heinkel He.162 Volksjäger People's Fighter from late World War II Nazi Germany. I did a video early on featuring the model on the left here. This is from Oxford. On the right is a new model from Solido-Warmaster. Both are 1/72 scale diecast. The Warmaster actually has gear up or down, and the Oxford is pretty much as you see it here, fixed. So a little nicer on the Solido model, but both are kind of budget range. But this was a budget range fighter, to say the least, with a neat history. So join me, will you? I've already done a video revisiting the Messerschmitt Me-262, quite lengthy, hopefully in depth. And in that I mentioned how Heinkel had been working on a jet fighter since before World War II. But they were finally rejected in March of '43. However, right as the 262 was coming online in the summer of 1944, two camps were forming in Germany about what to do. The Allies had lost air superiority. Everyone knew they were losing the war. But Camp 1, led by General Adolf Galland, wanted to focus more resources and effort on the Me-262, building as many as Germany could build, basically fighting the Allies' quantity advantage with a higher quality of fighter. And the second camp, which was supported by Goering and Speer, wanted to make a disposable fighter. They felt that the Me-262 had too many inherent problems and that it took too much time and resource to manufacture, and they wanted Germany just to have a simple, cheap, mass-producible fighter jet. So essentially quantity versus quantity, with the edge given to their forces because of jet power. Camp 2 eventually won out, and the Volksjäger People's Fighter program was established. And then on September 10th, requirements were outlined. Okay, the plane basically had to be cheap. It needed to be able to be made from non-critical resources, so things like wood. It needed to use the BMW 003 jet engine, which, was tried out in other planes but not found satisfactory. That's because the Junkers 004 was being used in the 262. It needed to be able to be assembled by non-skilled labor or even slave labor, so simple to assemble. As for the plane itself, it needed to weigh 2,000 kilograms or less, so 4,400 pounds or less. Capable of a top speed of at least 470 miles per hour. Be armed with two cannon, either 20 or 30 millimeter. It needed to be able to take off from relatively short and rough airfields, runways. And maybe perhaps kind of craziest of all, it needed to be simple to fly. In fact, the idea was that members of the Hitler Youth could learn to fly it quickly and effectively, which was, nuts. And companies had to submit a design proposal within 10 days because the idea was to put this into mass production by January 1, 1945. Several companies, surprisingly, responded, even though the criteria were extremely tight and limited, even unrealistic. Probably the most important one was Focke-Wulf, who had done the FW-190 and TA-152 high-performance piston planes. But Heinkel was pretty much always going to be the winner, because remember how in the 262 video I said they were ordered to focus on bombers? Well, they did, but they also kept toying around with jet designs. They had an internal company project known as Project 1078, more commonly known as Salamander, that they've been tinkering with since late 1943. And it happened to pretty much be exactly this kind of plane. Single engine, lightweight, straightforward, no frills, wartime production. So they had a pretty well fleshed out and figured out design already. So they were light years ahead of the competition, and they're one of the few companies that had extensive experience with jet engines. So, to very few folks' surprise, in October of 1944, the contract was awarded to Heinkel. Officially, this was known as the Volksjäger. The Salamander name from Heinkel also stuck. And it was also sometimes referred to as the Sparrow. And work on prototypes was immediate. And believe it or not, by December 6th, the first prototype took its first test flight. So less than 3 months after the program was even announced, and 2 months after Heinkel had been given the green light to go ahead. So you can't say anyone was dragging their feet, if nothing else. So what did Germany get with the Salamander? By the way, this was considered to be called the HE500, but they went with the name 162 because there had been an earlier fast bomber design under that name, so they were hoping to confuse any spy activity. Well, the fuselage, the plane is under 30 feet long, has a wingspan of 23.5 feet. It ended up with a very impressive maximum speed. Like I said originally, the criteria were at least 470 miles per hour. Well, this could do 490, no sweat, at sea level. Bump that up to 520 miles per hour at altitude. And it could even do just under 560 with emergency thrust and in certain situations. So pretty good. I mean, not quite as fast as the 262. Keep in mind we have one engine. It had a relatively small fuel tank, of less than 200 gallons. The original profile for this plane to be kind of a short-range interceptor only required 30 minutes flight time, which is good because that's pretty much all they got. It just had one kind of flexible bladder behind the cockpit for fuel. Keep in mind, though, at this point in the war, Germany did not have petrol to spare, so yeah, that was probably its biggest drawback, was low endurance. It had an ejection seat as standard, something Heinkel had introduced with their HE-280. It also had tricycle landing gear, fully retractable. The wings and much of the body were made of wood, with only critical components made of metal. Had 2 cannons. Initially, they were 30 caliber. They were the same Mark 108 used in the 262, and they carried 50 rounds each, so 100 rounds on board. We had one engine above the fuselage and what they call the nacelle, and yes, it was the BMW 003 type. It was a very light plane. Initially, when introduced, it was 4,400 pounds, give or take, as specified. But even before the prototype could be built, something unfortunate happened for Germany. The factory that manufactured the glue they planned to use to get the wings together was bombed. So, at the last minute in November, they had to find an alternative, and they went to a different type of glue. Like I said, on December 6th, the first prototype took its first test flight, and then on December 10, it was sent up again to show off for the RLM, the General Staff, and the plane broke apart in air, killing the pilot. Tests ultimately determined that it broke apart because the glue used, the replacement glue, was very acidic, very caustic, and actually broke apart the structure of the wood. So of course this had to be fixed. Throughout December and January, flights continued, issues continued to pop up with stability and flutter and other things. But keep in mind how quickly this plane was rushed through development and into prototype stage. It's no wonder. The third and fourth prototypes introduced reinforced wings. And they had tested those 30mm cannon, but this plane was so light that trying to fire them in air damaged the airframe. So they had to downgrade those to 20mm cannon. But it's not so bad because what's nice about the 20mm cannon, they were able to double their ammunition capacity up to 120 rounds per gun, so 240. So, smaller guns, but many more rounds. So not bad. That was one change. And that's when the HE-162-1 was replaced by the HE-162-2. Well, they basically did their best to band-aid solutions up to all the problems they found, and by January, the first test and evaluation squadron for these was established, and they would receive the first 46 Salamanders off the production line. And then in February, fighter training would start, and this would continue through March. It was more protracted than they had initially planned because Allied bombing kept setting things back. And of course, Germany was retreating all the long while. Originally, it had planned to have full rate production and doing 1,000 planes per month by April. And then they hoped to up that to 2,000 planes per month that summer. So they had goals, but even though the project had been quickly put in, yeah. The plane did see combat, though, believe it or not. By April, they were ready to go, and they started to be flown on their first sorties. And on April 19th, a He.162 achieved its only confirmed kill of a Hawker Tempest, I believe. But it's most likely that they shot a few others down, but at this time, the German Luftwaffe could not really afford to have gun camera footage, so yeah. We know that around 13 were lost that month, killing 10 pilots. The ejection seat was used 3 times, 2 times successfully. So it saved a couple of lives. Actually, out of those 13, only 3 were confirmed to be combat losses. In other words, only 3 were actually shot down. The other 10 were through operational mishaps and structural failure of the plane itself. By May 3rd, the remaining Salamanders were reorganized into new squadrons, reorganized into 2 alternative squadrons, but this wouldn't last very long. Already by May 5th, the general in charge of the region surrendered to the Allies because it was a lot better than surrendering to the Russians. So the He.162s were grounded permanently in the first week of May. By May 6th, the Allies reached the airfields where these were stationed at, so the planes were more or less willingly turned over and were quickly carted off as part of that greatly named Operation Lusty to America, also Britain. Britain absconded with several to test out itself. And of course, the Russians managed to get some Salamanders as well. And then, of course, the war was officially over on May 8th. So, 120 of these were accepted into Luftwaffe service. 200 more were ready to go, either at the factory or in supply areas. And another 600 were in various stages of assembly. So honestly, they were getting pretty close to meeting that 1,000 planes per month goal. This really was a simple, straightforward plane. But on the other hand, he was a good performer. What had really plagued Germany, 1943 and into 44, they started adding bigger and bigger guns. First, they would go to 30mm, then 37mm cannon, then even some 50mm cannon, not to mention those 55mm rockets. Great, but heavy. And they also started giving more and more armor to their planes. Great for the pilots, but heavy. So this started to negatively impact performance, and this plane goes to show you. This engine, the B&W engine, 2 of them really couldn't get the much heavier Messerschmitt 262 where it needed to be, but just 1, because of how light this airframe was, even though the gross weight after the stronger wings and the guns were added and a few other things was over 6,100 pounds, still it was a light plane. And because of that, it was able to fly around 500 miles per hour on average. By the way, it had a higher ceiling than the 262. This could get up past 39,000 feet, whereas the Messerschmitt really couldn't pass 37,500 feet. Minor point, but there you go. On the other hand, it was a little slower, but ejection seat was nice. Kind of a neat feature. If you notice, the edge of the wings has that droop to them. That was a late addition in January of 1945, right before these went into production, to help kind of control some of the stability and maneuverability issues they'd run into. Pretty neat little design flair to compensate for the relatively short wing and all that. They did plan to do a 2-seat training version, but very few were produced. They also planned to do a glider version for training, because remember, again, this was meant for very new pilots to fly. So they were trying to keep them simple. After the war, Eric Brown in the UK test flew this and had pretty good things to say about it. He particularly complimented the controls and the balance, but he definitely stated it was not a plane for beginners. It is an early jet, and it was rushed into production, and obviously shortcuts had been taken. Pretty much a forgotten fighter today. It is still a very neat part of history. It's just really amazing that they were able to design, prototype, develop, manufacture, and even do some basic refining on a plane like this in under half a year. So yeah, thought we'd just revisit it. Now that I've got this Warmaster model, this is the old IXO tooling. Just a little better detail, and again it has gear up or down, whereas the Oxford does not, but still very similar, including the price points. These are $20 to $30 models, so they're not going to break your bank, and they both do come with display stands, which is neat. Alrighty guys, I appreciate you tuning in. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And also, please feel free to check out some of my other videos. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. Thank you very much, and I will catch you very soon next time.